Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Leading by Legacy webinar on motivation. My name is Jose Mariscal, and I am with the Leading by Legacy program here at IACP. The Leading by Legacy is a part of the smaller agency program at the IACP and has been a multi-year initiative since 2009, funded by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Before we begin, there are a few key things about the GoToWebinar service that we want to make you aware of. First, you have the option to log in and listen to the audio portion of the webinar through your speakers and microphone or via phone. You will see these options on your control panel located in the top right corner of your screen once you've logged in. If you have any difficulty using the GoToWebinar, you can call IACP staff on the cell phone number provided on your screen. Once the control panel minimizes itself, you can click on the right-hand side to enlarge it if you need to view the hand icon, which we'll go into here in just a second. At the end of the presentation, we will be taking live questions from the audience. You can ask any questions by clicking on the hand icon, or you can submit them through the question on the question box located at the bottom of the control panel. Once you've submitted all your questions, I will read your questions to the panelists. Today's webinar audience consists of Leading by Legacy alumni, and the topic was selected as a point of interest among smaller agency leaders. Today's webinar panelist is Dr. Mitch Weinzettel, Director of Public Safety, Executive Leadership Master's Program from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. He's also the Chief of Police, Buffalo, Minnesota, and retired, and author of Acting Out, Outlining Specific Behaviors and Actions for Effective Leadership. At this time, I'm going to hand over control of the microphone and the keyboard over to Mitch Weinzettel.
Thanks a lot, Jose. And what Jose didn't mention is that I'm actually leaving my position with St. Cloud State to become a full-time staff member at IACP. And so this is a transition point for me in terms of being in a different position, but certainly looking forward to those new challenges that lie ahead. So without any further ado, we'll move on and we'll talk about, to start, and Jose mentioned this briefly, but why are we talking about motivation, and why was this webinar selected? The first thing is that understanding employee motivation is a common concern. As we've done the Leading by Legacy programs around the country, invariably the questions come up about, from the folks attending, they want to know how they can motivate their employees. And so there's a presumption there that it's the responsibility or the duty somehow of leaders to motivate the people that work for them. And we have tried through our program to explain to people that's perhaps a false assumption. In fact, that not so much about motivating employees as it is creating a space in which they can be motivated. So to that end, one of the issues is that oftentimes leaders are confused about how motivation works in the first place, and so they have difficulty influencing it. And I use the word influence intentionally because that's really what our objective is, and the influence actually relates to setting the right parameters in which people can be self-influenced or self-motivated. So we'll go on. When we talk about motivation, there are a lot of theories out there, and if you've ever attended a psychology class or maybe sociology or read any of the books along those lines, you've probably been exposed to a number of motivational theories, and I've listed a number of them here. They probably look familiar to you, and the good news is I'm not going to dig into those. In fact, part of the problem with those theories is that they often conflict with each other, and the details within those theories can be rather complex and oftentimes hard to understand and hard to apply. But today we're going to talk about a new theory which has its own intricacies, but I think is much more understandable and much more user-friendly. And that's a higher order goal personality trait theory. And we'll talk about that in some depth. Again, I think you'll find that it's a little easier to navigate and understand than perhaps what you've done before. Now, when we talk about motivation, we can say that it's defined as a process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal-oriented behaviors. And that's true, and that's a good definition in that motivation is what prompts people to do things. What's missing here is where that prompting originates. And again, the typical question or response from people is that leaders need to motivate their people, which suggests an external motivation as opposed to people being motivated internally. We'll talk more about that, but it's a key distinction that really doesn't find its way into most of the motivational definitions. So again, the question that always comes up is, how do we actually motivate others? And what I'm going to suggest is that we can motivate people to act through threats or coercion. But when we do that, it's a very narrow window of influence. And people that are motivated out of coercion or threats or fear will generally only do as much as they need to stay out of trouble. On the other hand, when we create an atmosphere in which people want to be self-motivated or individually motivated, we change that influence to one in which it's the employee who's doing the motivating, and it has a much better outcome than trying to use some other external force to motivate people. When we talk about leadership in general and motivation, leadership, and this is a definition that I kind of created through a number of different sources, but essentially it's the art of motivating people to voluntarily commit themselves to follow the course laid out by the leader. But the key here in motivating is about influence. And when we influence people, we cause them to behave in a way in which they might not otherwise behave. And we do that through a variety of mechanisms, but essentially what we're really trying to do is to change their belief system, and as a result of that, their behavior then will change as well. When we talk about leadership in particular, we often talk about leadership from a situational perspective, and you've probably heard of situational leadership. And there's really three legs to that component. The first is the situation itself, or the job, or the task, or whatever it is that needs to be done. The second one is the follower. And at somewhere within that discussion, we need to discuss the difficulty of the job and the preparedness for the follower to complete that job, and their willingness or motivation to complete it. And finally then, when we understand those pieces, the leader can find that sweet spot or that convergence point where they can apply the right type of leadership to the situation without using too much managerial pressure or too much coercion, or without turning the person loose on their own. And again, it's about creating that space where the person can do their job effectively and be satisfied with the work that they're performing. So in this slide, I want to talk a little bit about why motivation is so important. First of all, if we think about it, the slide here indicates that performance equals ability times motivation. We can have people within our organizations, and you likely do, that have a tremendous amount of ability, but if they're not motivated, they will not perform, or they certainly won't perform at a high level. And I had a circumstance with a colleague that I worked with who was tremendously capable, one of the most capable police officers I had ever known, but he was completely unmotivated, and as a result, he had nearly no performance whatsoever. Later in life, as an officer, he developed cancer, and it changed his life perspective, and he decided to get motivated, and he accelerated very quickly to a command role within that organization and did a tremendous job. But the point is, if you don't have ability or you don't have motivation, you're going to have a problem. Bottom line is you need them both to be successful and to achieve high performance. The other piece here is the fact that motivation equals retention. In many police agencies, officers come and go, and it's obviously very expensive to hire and train police officers, and every time we lose one, a lot of our skill and experience and our money walks out the door. But people that are motivated stick around, and the reason that they're motivated is because they have a good, positive work environment. And again, it goes back to the leader to create that space where you have a positive work environment and one in which individual can ultimately be self-motivated or independently motivated. Now, there are a few dimensions of motivation that are worth discussing, and the first one is direction. I once worked in an agency for about 10 years, and I can't recall a single instance of our police chief ever telling us as an organization where he wanted us to go, how he wanted us to carry ourselves, what he wanted us to do. And the reality is, if we don't explain to our people what it is that we want them to do, they will be rather directionless. So the first thing is you need to make clear what you want them to do, and that really is on a large scale or on a task or goal specific scale. The second thing is we need to talk about how hard should I try? How much effort do you really want me to put in? And I want to just touch on that a little bit, that my perspective, all supervisors within policing are in sales. And by that I mean that it's their job to take the direction that's provided, whether that's collective, collaborative direction, or whether that's direction that comes straight from the chief. It's their job to sell that direction to the folks in their organizations as if it was their own idea. For example, if the police chief suggests to the other supervisors that the officers need to write more tickets on Highway 25, the supervisor might go out to staff and say, gee, guys, we need to write more tickets on Highway 25 because the chief thinks we need to do that. That is going to result in a certain amount of effort. On the other hand, if the supervisor comes out and says, we've been having a lot of difficulties on Highway 25, there's been a lot of speeding, been some crashes, there's been some close calls, and as a department we need to get out there and work hard on it so that so that we can resolve this issue, that has a different flavor to it entirely. So it's important for people to know what you want them to do, but also how hard you should try. And then finally, how long do you want me to continue it? Sometimes we provide work direction, we provide a path that we want people to follow, but we don't hold people accountable to it. And so ultimately, although people might spend some time doing it, after a while their effort just kind of falls away and the whole task disappears as well. And maybe in some cases it's a short-term task, but if we're talking about long-term tasks, we need to make sure that people understand that. We also need to make sure that we hold them accountable to perform the task long-term. So when we talk about where motivation comes from, and I've already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but there are really two different types of motivation. There's extrinsic and intrinsic. And extrinsic motivation is motivation that occurs from some outside source, either as a reward or to avoid punishment. So, for example, if you were seated in a chair and I was to walk up to you and point a gun to your head and tell you to stand up, you would likely be motivated to stand up. But my argument is that in the end, you're still making a decision about whether or not you are going to engage in a certain action, and in this case, whether you're going to stand up. So there is an external force trying to get you to do something, but in the end, it's still your decision. When we use extrinsic motivation, certainly our staff will respond to that. They know if they don't follow a directive, they could get suspended or lose their job. They know that they need to follow the rules in order to collect a paycheck and be able to, pay their bills. So those extrinsic motivations are certainly a part of the equation. But those pieces and parts don't get to the central internal motivation that drives cell. So even though people do get motivated through external factors, it's really not the primary or the most effective mechanism for motivating people to do things. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is all about the personal reward or the desire that the person has, the enjoyment, job satisfaction that they attain from doing whatever it is that they're doing. That comes from inside. And when people are intrinsically motivated or internally motivated, they will work very hard to accomplish whatever goal or whatever task they are working on because they find it personally rewarding. So again, that extrinsic motivation arises from outside, while intrinsic arises from within. So as we continue the discussion, we need to spend a little time talking about growth needs. And essentially, we need to talk about the fact that we can classify our people as having either high growth needs or low growth needs. And it's very important to understand that this is not a discussion about whether someone is capable, whether they have good skill, whether they're productive, or whether they're active. It's about to what degree do they want to learn, grow, or assume responsibilities within their position. Oftentimes in policing, there is a fallacy that everybody in our organization wants to be a supervisor, and in fact, that's just not true. Oftentimes, people that have low growth needs are very comfortable doing their job just as it is. They're really not interested in further growth, and as a result of that, when we try to push them in that direction, it actually works, has a reverse effect, and they can actually become demotivated. On the other hand, high growth needs people are very interested in seeking additional responsibility and challenges. And for them, they are the happiest when they experience high levels of meaningfulness, responsibility for the outcome, and knowledge of the actual results of their work. These are the pieces that drive high growth needs individuals. And as you're going to see in a little bit, we're going to break those down and talk about how those pieces relate to motivation. Now, on the other hand, low growth needs individuals, as I mentioned, they're really not interested in carrying the burden or challenge of responsibility. They're oftentimes detached from decision-making processes, and a person might think that they don't really care what the outcome is. They do care what the outcome is, but they either trust that others are going to take on the roles that they need to and make the right decisions, or they're just apathetic, and they will roll with the changes when they arrive. It's important to understand that low growth needs individuals, if they're doing their job effectively, there's nothing wrong with that, and we don't necessarily have to push them to jump into high growth needs positions. The other thing I'll mention is that in my police department, we had number of supplemental job duties, and I would imagine you do as well. Everyone in my department was expected to have additional supplemental responsibilities. But when it came to low growth needs individuals, we selected those responsibilities that didn't have leadership or oversight kind of components to them, and that were simple tasks, albeit tasks that need to get completed, but simple tasks that some of our low growth needs folks could do without feeling overburdened. So that brings us to this motivational theory that we're going to discuss today. And this is a theory that was recently created based on some research done by Barrick, Mount, and Lee. And essentially, this is a higher order goal personality trait theory model. It's a mouthful. Here's what it really means. Each of us have specific personality traits. Those personality traits initiate within us certain purposeful goal strivings. And those goal strivings lead to experienced meaningfulness in our work. So we have the purposefulness, which is the process through which our personality traits push us to pursue and achieve certain higher order goals. But we also have meaningfulness. That relates to the sense that our work and our effort is valued, and it's useful and worthwhile and pleasing to us, essentially. So within this theory, there are a few components, and this is the first section. Essentially what you have here are 4 different higher order goal strivings: communion striving, autonomy growth striving, status striving, and achievement striving. Well, let me break these down just a little bit for you. Most people have someone in their department that they know who seems to know everyone. They know all the cops around, even police officers from other areas. If you go into a restaurant, they know people. If they're walking down the street, they know people. These are communion striving folks. They thrive on meaningful contact with others, and they thrive on not only knowing everyone else, but having everyone else know them. They want, if someone has a problem, they want to know that the first person that person is going to think of is them. Status striving are those folks that have a desire to exert power and influence over others within the organizational hierarchy. What that basically describes is pretty much all of our supervisors within policing. And I want to point out that when we talk about this having a desire to exert power and influence over others, that really should not be viewed as a negative thing. There are people who see themselves as having the capacity to be good leaders and to set direction. And in order to do that, it's necessary to have the ability to exert that power and influence over others. So that's status striving. Autonomy growth striving are those folks that are motivated to gain control and understanding of the important aspects of their work environment and to pursue personal growth opportunities. These people want to take their capability to a high level, and they want to be left alone to complete their tasks and to have ownership over those tasks. The achievement striving individuals, they have a powerful need to demonstrate personal competence and a sense of accomplishment. These are the people that are trying to demonstrate tremendously high expertise in particular areas. So let me just back up for a second and talk about these again in terms of how they relate to motivation. If you have an individual within your organization who is a communion striving person, and I imagine you can probably think of that person right now, imagine what you could do to kill that person's spirit. In other words, what kind of a job could we assign to that person to make them miserable in their work? Well, if you have a communion striving person, the best thing you could do to make them miserable is assign them to a job where they don't have any contact with anybody. For example, put them in charge of the evidence room, or maybe even some other desk job where they're shuffling papers all day long. Maybe if they're doing the report review or the intake review on reports. That individual will be miserable in that role. On the other hand, if you put that person in a high contact role, like a community policing officer, an investigation role, something where there's a significant amount of contact both internally and externally, that person is going to thrive and excel. Status striving. We take someone who has a high desire to learn and grow and to move into the supervisory ranks. It's easy to take away their spirit by not sending them to training, not giving them opportunities to exercise any leadership. On the other hand, we can easily send these people to supervisor training before they're supervisors, which is what we should do. Or we can put them in quasi-leadership roles like field training officers, for example. And it gives them an opportunity to be in that leadership position and to grow and hopefully develop those skills as they move forward. The same thing holds true, and we could do examples of autonomy, growth striving, and achievement striving. But the point is, if we recognize where people are within these higher order goals, we can then figure out whether or not we've got them in the right position or whether we actually have them in a position that's working against what they really are looking for. So the next slide just outlines something called the 5-factor model of personality traits. You can see the 5 different traits here. These have been researched extensively for many years, and frankly, the research out there is consistent that these are the 5 different types of personalities that exist in society. You may have experienced these if you've taken a Myers-Briggs or some other personality test. If you did, they were measuring these kinds of personality traits. So what we know, and what's really not in question, is that each of us has these types of personality traits. Generally, we have a mix of these traits, but also most of us have one that is quite dominant over the others. So what Barrick and Mount and Lee did is they took these personality characteristics and they did research to see which personality characteristics connect with which higher order goal strivings. But they also understood and recognized that there were 2 other components that are at play that influence people's job satisfaction, and those are task characteristics and social characteristics. So from a task characteristics perspective, we're talking about the work that someone does. One is task identity, in other words, completing the whole piece of work from start to finish. I like to say, if you've ever built anything, one of the cardinal rules of building something is when you're done to stand back and look at your awesomeness in having completed that task. And that's what task identity is all about. Task variety is about the ability to use different skills in our job and not doing the same thing over and over again like you might on an assembly line. Task significance relates to your capacity to contribute to a work outcome in a substantial way. When you have significant role in the completion of work, that's task significance. Autonomy is the discretion and decision making, and then of course feedback. And I want to just mention that oftentimes we have conversations about next generation workers, and I would tell you that autonomy and feedback are very important to the younger generation or that next generation of workers that are coming into our workforce. They definitely want to build themselves up, make themselves a commodity that is marketable, and they want to have autonomy in their work, but they also want to hear regularly how they're doing, and certainly if they're not doing something well, they want to hear that too, but they need constant feedback. So these are all the pieces that go into the task characteristics component. Then we also have the social characteristics, and here we have, again, talking about the ability to interact with people in or outside the organization, strong desire for people to develop interpersonal relationships, and also to exchange support with others. When we take all of these different pieces and we put them in a chart, this is what we get. And what you can see is that starting on the left side, we have the 4 different motivational strivings or goals. On the right side, we have the personality traits that tend to be associated with those types of goals. And in the middle, you can see how the task and social characteristics interact with those components. What we're really suggesting here is if you consider the people within your organization from a personality standpoint, you can begin to get an idea of what their motivational strivings might be. Once you understand that, and you can look at the task and social characteristics as well, but once you understand that, you can then structure your work assignments to those individuals in a way that creates an atmosphere where they are deriving the most joy and meaningfulness from their work. That translates into motivation or high performance. If they've got the ability, motivated, because they're intrinsically motivated, they're doing something that meets and connects with their higher order goals, they're going to work harder at it, they're going to put in more effort, and the byproduct of that is high performance. So let's talk a little bit about some leader strategies for motivation. Number one, it's important to know what motivates your employees before you hire them, if possible. In my department, we didn't have a canine or a SWAT program, but we oftentimes had people come in interviews and they would say, well, I want to be a canine guy or a SWAT guy. Obviously, that person's not going to be a good fit. It's important for you to know what the parameters are of your organization, what are your expectations for the people that come in, and make sure that you not only communicate those to people that are applying, but that you watch for those factors as people are going through the hiring process. The next thing is learn and stay informed about what motivates your people. Again, using that chart, consider what motivates them, but also recognize people's motivations can change, and they definitely do. A brand new single officer might have certain goals in their career, and when they get married and have kids, it might change that entirely. So it's important to watch for those shifts. Also important, create a challenging environment for those high growth needs individuals. These people really thrive on challenge, and we have to put those challenges in front of them, or they will become bored and frustrated and demotivated. Give rewards that provide information versus those that control. Autonomy is a key factor. In cases where we can release the grip and let people do their job, they will be much happier with their work and their work environment. And then understand the limitations of those employees that are low growth needs. Don't try to turn these folks into something that they're not, and don't try to push them into a category that ultimately is going to result in them pointing themselves or you. I can tell you I'm aware of a person who was promoted to sergeant who really didn't want the job, but took the job at the urging of their people in the organization, and it was not a good fit. They didn't like the job, and they ultimately self-demoted. Everybody loses in that equation, so just recognize there are differences between the high growth need and low growth need individuals, and make sure that you treat each of those groups the way that you ought to. The other thing is establish clear core values and purpose. Organizationally, people need to understand what we're about, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. We want to think about our long-term objectives within our work environment. What is it that's important? And it's our expectation as leaders to create those perspectives for people. That helps them understand their role within that process. Supervise the leadership of small work groups or units. Let those small groups or units flourish. Let them learn and grow. Keep an eye on them. Make sure that you're in constant communication with them and within your whole organization. Make sure you're asking your people what different job opportunities interest them. Again, promote collaboration. That's not just a motivational thing, but certainly from a leadership perspective. Providing opportunities for development, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. It's really important for us to create a space for our people in which they can grow. Oftentimes, when we talk about this, leaders will, lament that, well, gee, I sent this one guy to all this training, and then he left, and that's true. That does happen, but the reality is this: some people are going to leave, some people won't. But even if the people leave you, if they're good people and you provide them opportunities for development and you train them, you have the luxury of having them within your organization that whole time they are in it. So don't be reluctant to provide those intentional development opportunities for people. And then lastly, really just go back to the chart that we looked at and look for work opportunities that match the motivational needs of your staff. I understand that not everybody can be the community policing guy, but even if there aren't those major objectives available to match all of those higher order goals and strivings, oftentimes there are secondary job assignments where we can place people that meet those same needs. So again, try to understand where your people are, look for those categories, and try to figure out where they reside in the higher order goals and strivings. And with that, we're at the question section.
Thank you, Mitch. I am looking right now. I don't see any questions that are here. But again, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank BJA. This will get posted up on the Legacy website, and you will receive a follow-up email should you have any questions for Dr. Weinzettel or the Legacy staff. But I think that is all. So again, thank you to all of you for attending, and thank you, Mitch.